a podcast where we deep dive into managing enterprise data products and platforms. What initially drew you to the open source world and how your perspective evolved over the years?
Over the years, my perspective has evolved, and I found that you can get involved easily in open source, and over time, get deeper and deeper involved and see how the whole ecosystem starts to form.
Steven is a seasoned executive with extensive experience in building open source deep tech enterprise products.
People to use software and turn them into possible businesses. The fact that anyone can contribute is really exciting to me. When you need early users, open source is a great way to get those users and solve their problems.
How do you shift this perception, especially when there are so many people contributing to it, at the same time balancing that with building business model?
Sometimes driving the project forward, you have to balance, it's more of a consensus in driving that with lots of very strong-minded folks.
He's currently the co-founder and CEO of a stealth reliable AI startup.
People assume that the community will just turn into paying customers. It takes a ton of patience and strategy. My goal now is to try to give back as much as I can and then continue to do meaningful, exciting projects, exciting things.
How do you really see this intersection of AI and open source evolving? What are the opportunities? Where do you think you're seeing some challenges coming?
All right. Welcome to the Data Product Files, a podcast where we deep dive into managing enterprise data products and platforms. Today, we are thrilled to have Steven joining us. Steven is a seasoned executive with extensive experience in building open source deep tech enterprise product. He's currently the co-founder and CEO of a stealth reliable AI startup and previously served as the CEO of Ahana, which IBM acquired. Steven has also held leadership positions at Alluxio, Aviatrix Systems, and Couchbase. His unique insights into building successful businesses around open source products make him the perfect guest for today's discussion. So, Steven, your career has spanned various roles in open source companies. What initially drew you to the open source world and how your perspective evolved over the years?
So great to be here, Richa and Suhas. Super excited to chat with you. What initially drew me to open source was the collaboration and how that collaboration turns into not only great innovative technology, but also it is a distribution model for people to use software and turn them into possible businesses too. The fact that anyone can contribute is really exciting to me. And that's a level of transparency and democratization as it relates to open source software eating the world. And over the years, my perspective has evolved. And I found that, you can get involved easily in open source and over time, get deeper and deeper involved and see how the whole ecosystem starts to form. And that's how successful businesses can be created as well. So it's about not just tech, but it's the health of the community, as well as some of the dynamics of governance and where the project is hosted, for example.
Got it. And so when you first started, right, how did within your three different types of businesses, Alluxio, Ahana, and Couchbase, how did the sort of business changed over the years with these three businesses?
Yeah, so my first open source project, I was at a company called Couchbase, and Couchbase was a combination of Membase and CouchDB, and it was a distributed NoSQL database. And at that time, the open source business models were still pretty young. This is back in 2008. And up until then, there weren't very many outcomes for businesses. Of course, MySQL was acquired for $1 billion. However, it wasn't viewed as a major commercial success at the time. And I appreciate what MySQL is and everything else. So hopefully I'm not getting too many enemies by saying that. And Red Hat was the only other player that had a big exit or a big success. Of course, since those days, over the last 10 years, open source has picked up a ton of steam and the kinds of valuations and the power of it is more understood. So Couchbase was the first one. And, back then it was the distributed systems nature that helped companies start to have business models which charged by the server instance. And as you have them clustered, like Hadoop was clustered, so was NoSQL databases. This really helped change the equations as it relates to how do you make money from that. If you have a single node database like MySQL and it's running on I'll say a monolithic server with a 16-way machine with dozens and dozens of chips in it, but you can only charge one software license. It's pretty hard to make a business off of that. Now, that was selling commercial versions of open source software. We called them subscriptions, and that started to follow into the subscription pay-as-you-go model over time.
Yep.
And so that was back then. As we went forward, I'll just go to was in open source projects like Alluxio, which was an intelligent distributed caching layer for analytics, and then Ahana, which was based off of open source Presto. And in that case, we didn't have enterprise software that we sold. We sold it via a managed service. And so that was a cloud managed service and allowed people to get access to that with much more ease of use. And so that's kind of how these business models have evolved with cloud. And there's also native versions on the cloud, but then there's usually one of the premier vendors offering enterprise versions of a managed service. Hopefully that makes sense.
That does make sense. And it seems like as the databases were evolving, like your journey kind of evolved with that. And the business model also evolved with that, right? Anything that was starkly different from, say, your Couchbase days to your Ahana days, like in terms of just building around open source technologies?
I think there's a couple of things that are the nuances of this is, a number of these databases, for the newer databases, many all had an open source go-to-market model. So there's few since those days of like the RDBMSs, Oracle, everything else that are doing it that way. And I think the thing to note is that depending on how the project evolves, there's typically two main ways they evolve. One is it's a company that is running the project and started and open source the project, or it's perhaps a large hyperscaler company that invested heavily into this project and then spun out the project. And there may be one or more companies that are involved with that. And typically they spin it out. They have it hosted at one of the I call it gold standard hosting organizations like Apache Software Foundation, ASF, or Linux Foundation, which is the one I've been mostly involved with over the years. Now, that difference between whether it's a community-driven project or a company-driven project is one of the high-level things that need to be understood. Sometimes customers don't quite understand what that is, but it's they both have pros and cons from building a company around it. Let me tell you a little bit about that. So like a company control project, Couchbase, MongoDB. Yes, there's a strong community about it, but we have to do all the uplift for community development as well as build out the core of the product for the most part. A lot of times there's other contributors, but they're around the periphery. That's as opposed to if you're working in a community project, well, then those projects, what I mean by that is there's no one single vendor that controls it wholly, partly because that's how Linux Foundation and ASF, they try to provide governance to allow it to be a community-driven project. And so you get the benefit of a lot of companies involved. So in the case of Presto and Ahana, it was Meta, Facebook had formerly and changed to Meta, and Uber and Alibaba and other companies like that, all major users, all contributing heavily to the core, as well as a community around that. And so we were working in that model, partnering with them. Great to work with Meta. They were super important to and really cared about the open source project. Not saying it was the easiest to work with, but we did find ways to work together, and that's the dynamic associated with it. And those partnerships were extremely important in the Linux Foundation, Presto Foundation.
Steven, you mentioned a little bit about Ahana, and while you were explaining some of these, evolutions, I may say, right? Like how it was while in your Couchbase days versus now. I've always had this question around perception. Open source, in some people's minds, is seen like free software, right? How do you shift this perception, especially when there are so many people contributing to it, at the same time balancing that with building a business model around this, right? So, especially for younger entrepreneurs listening into this, how do they balance between, yes, essentially building a really, really great open source software, but at the same time supporting that with figuring out a great, enterprise plan, or, building a great business model around that. If you could, help break that down.
Yeah, at the beginning, deciding to open source the project is a way to attract people to use it, and they become the first users of the project. If it's a case where you're not, like say, at Facebook or Meta and building it for yourself and then rolling it out, when you need early users, open source is a great way to get those users and solve their problems. So, and you can move very fast if you're a company control project. If it's a community control project, just to finish that thought, that's the difference. You got a great community because there's many big players and they're all talking about it. But then sometimes driving the project forward, you have to balance. It's more of a consensus in driving that with lots of very strong-minded folks. And so getting to this free software, that's typically, as it relates to users, there's many people who want to leverage software without having to talk to salespeople. They'll oftentimes look to the open source to see if it's available, and then they can itch their own scratch. They can try it out. They can contribute back to the project, and that's a great value to the company that they may work for. Now, over time, as those deployments become, from maybe an experimental under the radar, it starts to become a tier 2 application within a company, or even a tier 1 application. Well, oftentimes then someone there will say, "Hey, what's that software you're using? And tell us about that, and who wrote that software, and what's going to happen if something doesn't work?" Or our security team needs these enterprise features now because we're using it so much. And then that usually draws in the inbound conversation to the vendor and says, "What can you offer us?" And we say, "Okay, we can offer you a commercial version that's gives you a lot of those additional commercial features that you may want. It allows you to accelerate the roadmap." Talking about product, there's of course tons of backlog. Well, guess what? You can prioritize some that the whole community is clamoring of free users, but then you may need to prioritize some of paying users, and that's okay. And over time, what we've done is, as you have more, say, features that are just for the commercial versions, those can be added to the open source later. And that tends to be a great way to balance the needs versus keeping it completely proprietary for others. So there's a whole evolution on the product roadmap, and sometimes it's okay to do it that way.
Got it.
So it seems like, Steven, that open source actually helps the managed services vendor or the company who's actually maintaining the project, like depending on what stake you're taking, actually get, say, the pre-sales work done, because somebody like enthusiastic engineer, let me call that person, that would download the software, apply, like use it in their company, and then when it becomes a mature use case, your pre-sales work is kind of done. And then is it fair to say that like what open source model really helps you with is, like, rather than doing tons of investment into pre-sales and stuff, you actually do that investment into community building, so that you find more and more of these enthusiastic engineers who try out the project, who actually use it in their respective use cases. And once everything is kind of a done deal, that's where the enterprise contract comes in.
A big part of the power of open source is the distribution model. That's right. People can use it for free. And as long as there is product, people have to be careful about, if you give all the value out, then it can really struggle to be a successful startup, especially in this day and age where you have to get a lot of ARR before you can become a standalone public company. But it's a balance of getting the distribution and then having an approach where there's more inbound leads that are already pre-qualified, already know what the product is, are just looking to get some questions answered and get maybe some features or get support, and then purchase a commercial license for the software, whether that's a managed service or through just installed software. So, but I think that balance takes a lot of work. And what I recommend and what we've done in every company I've been at is, there's new development. We before the release comes out, there's a discussion between sales. There's a discussion between a product and engineering the engineers want to get all their features to be used, right? And that's generally the case most of the time. And that's usually where they are. Sales wants everything to be walled off and you got to pay for it, right? And then lastly, you have the community team there, and they want more community, and they know that features are going to help with that. So that's the right tension. And so that's what we found was really important, where a product will facilitate that, give the pros and cons, make recommendations, taking all the input, and then that's fundamentally product has to build all those things. Has to build a business, has to build a community if that's the strategy, and then work with engineering to prioritize the right features as you go along.
So if I can actually ask another follow-up to that, and basically maybe ask for a very specific example, or it could be a specific example, or it could be like a pattern that you've observed across all your companies, where some of the features community wanted to push as table stake open source features and sales wanted it to be a gated feature. What were those kind of features that have repeatedly come up in your time across the three companies?
So one example would be at Couchbase, where we had a clustered distributed NoSQL database, and we had the syncing capability to another one. So it's called cross data center replication. And so that was like, well, people are saying, this is a pretty big deployment if you have, cross clusters, to have, uptime and reliability. And so, of course, sales wanted to be completely proprietary, and the same dynamics we talked about, right? So if you think about the feature, right? Okay, would any community user necessarily use this? But we wanted to have like major, public users that were hyperscalers too. And so that was a feature that they needed also.
Yep.
So what are you going to do? And that was where the first versions we made open source. And then there were additional features on top of that, the base functionality, which then we had some proprietary. And that was back then. I don't know what's happened since then, but that is an example. Hopefully that helps.
Yeah, that's great, because you can. It's a big enough substantial functionality that you can open source, but as you add to that functionality, you can keep that as closed source, because you want those hyperscalers to come back with an enterprise contract for your company. That's awesome.
And there's also the time element, right? We said, well, later, even if we have some enterprise features, we'll make them open source later too. And it was maybe 12, 18 months delayed, and we would review it. Right. And we come back to it and say, can we now open source this? Because we have a few more things on the proprietary side that seem to be moving forward. And there's, we haven't talked about right? Product needs to keep track of three things: customer needs, and then competitive, what else is being offered, and then your stuff, right? And so that intersection is what it is about, in my view. And so if the market, like, okay, MongoDB is now offering that, and it is now become table stakes, it's an issue. And that starts to be something where, everyone has to balance that out as part of the input to that decision.
Steven, it feels like now there seems to be like a playbook around this, and I'm guessing this episode is going to be a masterclass in that. So I'll go a level deeper into the business side. While you were building out your companies, of course, you were figuring out a lot of things. But at that point of time, were there some specific companies / models that you were following that you think have really, really implemented it really well, that you can share with the others here? What were some of the models out there that you thought have executed really well?
Well, I'll just go to more, more these days. It's more about the managed services. And there's two approaches to doing that. Either you can have a cloud service that's completely, especially in the data world, you ingest everything into your cloud, which requires you to be very secure. Or you can have a managed service where you're deploying software and via control system that does that. I think Databricks has done a phenomenal job at that, and they had both in VPC model, and over time they've also added the ingest everything model, and I think that was a great way of doing that. They did that fantastic job. Plus, they had a community that they did extremely well with. I think that's the kind of stuff that things you should think about. Now, some would argue that, hey, you don't need to do then customer VPC because it's a little more complicated. It's so much easier if you go the other route. Well, it kind of depends on what your product is, and it's hard to do all of it at once. But that is, especially if you're doing PLG, then those are factors in deciding what you're going to do. Now, in the HANA case, we only did the in customer VPC model. I think that's a great model for most enterprises because they don't want to give the data out. We're talking about AI. It's an issue where people don't want your data to be trained on large language model. And that's even more of a there's a lot more awareness about that these days.
Richa, I think maybe the right time to dive deeper into some of the stories, especially I think Ahana is something that I'm very excited to go deeper into.
So you talked about like in VPC model and that Ahana was using an in VPC model. So maybe let's start there. Like, how did you decide that the way we're going to approach this is going to be in VPC? And how did you in some ways started becoming the leading vendor for the Presto project, right? Because it originated in Facebook. Meta got like a lot of kudos for like starting the project, and there were so many bigger players, like you mentioned previously, that were getting involved maintaining the project. So what was the journey to become the leading vendor using the in VPC business model?
First, on the architecture, that's a little separate from being a part of the project. The architecture was more of a decision on how we were going to build a business and what types of customers we were going to target. And so what we saw is that large companies could handle Presto, the care and feeding, and there would be other companies that may want something that's much more managed, and that was, but didn't want to extricate the data. So where I had come up with that was previously I was in the networking side, cloud networking with Aviatrix. And Aviatrix was doing a cloud service for a multi-cloud networking, how we could do launch routers into people's clouds, into their VPCs, and then give a lot of enterprise features on top of that. But it was like a managed service for that. And so that was the reason why, if you VPC is all about networking, it made a lot of sense to me that we would do that for Ahana. Now, to get to the other question about the Presto project, I think it went down in history as there were some Presto wars that were going on, just like there were the container wars, and I was involved in that time a little bit with Mesos and Kubernetes and Docker, and so what I saw there was that Linux Foundation did a phenomenal job of trying to make sure the industry could do really, really well and have some standardization, and that occurred between CoreOS and Docker if you go back in history there. And the rest is history, right? Kubernetes has become the leading to-do distributed systems almost everywhere, multi-cloud, right?
Yeah.
Now in the data analytics, Presto's a phenomenal SQL query engine that can scale and handle petabytes of data. Largest lake houses in the world are made with Presto, right? And so there were some. When I say the Presto wars, there was the original developers, and they did a phenomenal job at growing a community while being within Facebook, Meta. And then when they left, they decided to fork the project into something they called similarly as Presto SQL. And then Meta decided to donate the project, the original Presto DB project, to Linux Foundation to ensure the openness and success of the project. And so that was, we thought, there needed to be more vendors in the Presto Foundation. And that's when I started work on looking at doing that. Now, in thinking about this for us and Ahana, we were fine if it came back together, just like it happened with the whole container ecosystem. I'm talking about Run C and other projects like that. And we thought that if that's a community project and they could come together and we'd all work together on the project. And that would be a little difficult for us because they would surely dominate the project for the most part if that were to occur. But we'd have our slice of it and do a managed service and those things, right? And so that was one path that you could go down. So we wrote the strategy for that. And then the other path was they stay separate. That was, in a way, meant there was more potential for us to be important to the project. And that's exactly what ended up happening, right? Open source projects are they're not the most friendly places. They're when you talk about, I call them, all open source projects are kind of violent places, because even the act of a fork is like, hey, I'm going to take my stuff and you're all coming with me, and people say, are we going or staying? And that was a lot of what happened. A lot of people had to decide if they're going or staying. But I think it's worked out for both projects. I think Presto Foundation is continuing to do really great. IBM is a strong proponent of open source Presto, and they continue to invest heavily in the project, as well as the native C++ versions of the project, which give it phenomenal performance. So we really encourage everyone to check it out, whether it's using the IBM Ahana managed service or something else. It's now called watsonx. And that's for a lot of enterprises, as well as smaller companies can use it. So that was some of the history of kind of what took place and what I was thinking as we were doing this. And I think all the community, I mean, the creators, they wrote all the original code at the beginning too. So there's no denying their impact to the whole industry with both the fork and the original. But now time has gone on, it's kind of bifurcated. And so I would say that there's the community open source project of Presto. We encourage people to join it. Everyone's welcome. Our bylaws are about welcome, and there's no one company that controls the project. Whereas the other one is more of a company control project, and vibrant community also. And I appreciate what they've done.
Awesome. Steven, I'm going to up level one bit from the story. Like, one thing that was constantly coming to my head was like, you somehow have a knack of figuring out if this project is going to be big, right? Like, you've done it like multiple times now. So when you're like actually like evaluating a project for yourself personally, like, okay, do I want to be involved? Do I want to invest my next roughly like 3 to 5 years into something like this? What goes on into your head, and how do you make that decision personally? Because time is the biggest, player here, right? So how do you make that decision in your head?
So I'm fortunate that I live in Silicon Valley with you're here, Richa, right? And there's so much networking and people that are available to help with that. And so I'm not the technologist here, and I look to customers for that. So an example was there's a fruit company down the street there, and I know someone there, and I said, hey, what are the next up and coming open source projects? He said, well, on my whiteboard, I've got Mesos, I've got Kafka, got Presto up there. These are the ways that where pretty much they're very, very early days, right? Those had not even started yet, right? And so then I start to do some work and get to know the community and get to know some of the people if it's possible to do so. So that was an example, kind of go to the people who have big problems and then are solving them with open source projects. And then, that's usually the future of where everything's going, right? Kubernetes came out of, Google, right? They were dealing with distributed compute for a long time. They did a phenomenal job, and they added the community to it. So that's kind of how that worked.
Yeah, I think you mentioned, okay, this is how you would select projects, and I mean a real example of how you did it back in the day when this space was still evolving. But to me, it feels like, okay, now there's just so much happening. How did you pick your latest? I know you're working on something new. How did that idea come through? Was that something similar? Did you find this pain point in a similar way?
It is networking again. I got to know my co-founders through the network, and
Right.
Everyone's trying to help people. That's the way Silicon Valley is. And, there's for sure a pecking order of these things. If you have integrity, credibility, you're known for a while, or you have credentials, all that goes a long way. And then fundamentally, being out there and creating products, creating businesses, all those matter. And so I encourage people to come to San Francisco and be in San Francisco, where AI is the capital, AI capital of the world, I'd say. and it's not as bad as they say, as the doom loop they're saying it is. And I'm on San Francisco, and
Yeah, no, for sure.
because those are invaluable, right? Every day there's some networking event, and I meet
True.
people all the time through that, and try to
Right.
contribute. My goal now is try to give back as much as I can, and then continue to do meaningful, exciting projects and exciting things.
Definitely convince me to move from South Bay, Steven. I'm moving.
Richa, you are going to come up, I think. You mentioned that, so welcome.
We were talking about the Valley. So, Stephen, everything is about AI in the Valley today. And I'd love to jam with you on the future of open source, given you've seen that evolution now with your current focus on AI. How do you really see this intersection of AI and open source evolving, right? What are the opportunities? Where do you think, you're seeing some challenges come through here?
Well, LLMs and multimodal models are incredible, right? And this is a huge platform shift taking place right now. It's a great time to be in this area, and I encourage all the listeners to get involved. Yesterday, today, open source, just like it was with these other projects, they're developed in a lot of these large companies, and so and that table stakes comparisons are happening. And so, it changed a lot just with when Llama 2 came out last year. Lots of folks, it just changed the way people thought. And Meta is incredible for yet again providing a great project out there. Now, I know that it's weights, but it's not the data to train on those things. But still, it's a phenomenal that those Llama is continuing to be out there, and that's, in my view, driving a lot of Google's thinking around pushing more open source projects. I didn't think multimodal was going to go open source. I thought it'd be much more proprietary for things, but lo and behold, they're all happening like that. And I think that's in this dynamic, it's different because it's not like you can just join Llama, right? It's not like you can join Gemini. Instead, it's a type of system that you can host yourself. And then it's about so I'm a big believer in the vertical agents that are next, and that's where things are going. And so in those cases, whether it may not be open source, those verticals, but it'll leverage a lot of open source. And that's kind of how I see that shaping up.
So you've seen how open source worked with databases, and a lot of companies came about at the time. Similar thing is happening with AI, where a lot of open source companies are coming up. The recent batch of YC had a ton of open source AI companies that are coming about. If you were to draw parallels, Steven, what are some of the mistakes, if I were to call it, or learnings that you're seeing getting repeated with the new age open source AI companies?
Well, so when I was going out to look at these I call it the AI wrapper case. Okay, AI wrappers, you can do great things using the APIs. However, there's a big challenge of being durable, and you can get through that. As we've seen companies like Jasper AI, which was doing marketing types of writing solutions, and then they had a difficulty with OpenAI ChatGPT there, but they were able to sustain that. I think they've done. They're a case where they made it through. But if I were to start now with just a wrapper approach, gosh, I mean, I think it's going to be very challenging. And it's so you have to really know what your differentiators are versus be a me too, and what's your the deep tech differentiation, and that is it just fine tuning? I don't think so. And then startups have to get data. These are all difficult challenges for folks that are in this space. So that's probably the AI wrappers are the things that I would avoid, and because it may be very difficult later on to maintain that position.
Richa, Stephen, just for the paucity of time, I know we're on the dot, but I'd love to do a very quick rapid fire with you, Stephen. Maybe take the top 3 to 5. Richa, we'll go back to back. Stephen, whatever comes to your mind first. I'll pick one that I found the most interesting. And Steven, I'll go first. So the first one for you is name a proprietary software you think should be open source, and why do you think that?
ChatGPT.
That's an easy one. That's an easy
I mean,
one.
they're spending so much money on it that, and it was meant to be open. So, okay, before I guess it's changed now, but give us the last version when it was,
Yeah.
and then let it fork.
Yeah, didn't do post GPT-2, so makes total sense. Okay, the next one for me, on more of a personal note, what's a productivity hack that you rely on every day, Steven?
Follow up then. So I have reminders. So I use a lot of reminders. This way I don't have to think about it. It's like
Yep,
Boomerang, Gmail Boomerang. I've been using that for forever.
Got it.
makes sense.
That's a nice one. Steven, if you could have dinner with three pioneers from the tech world, who would those be?
Steve Jobs, Linus Torvalds, and Jeff Bezos.
That's
Different
an easy
visions of
one.
innovation and leadership, right? Three different, very different visions.
Name a product you secretly love but never endorse publicly.
Microsoft Excel.
I agree. I would say the same, yes.
But I don't care to admit it.
Yeah, the powerhouse. Okay, I'll go with the last one from my side. Steven, what's one product idea that didn't see the light of the day, but you regret not pursuing it? Do you have something like that?
It was a set of Meta glasses for the vision impaired.
Oh,
Oh, the
that's it.
Meta, yeah, but for vision impaired.
Oh wow, oh wow. Okay, that's an interesting one.
Since this episode has been all about open source, so I'm gonna ask the last question around open source, which is what is the biggest misconception about building a business which is open source that you think should go away?
The business misconception is that it's easy to monetize. Getting that right takes product thinking, and people assume that the community will just turn into paying customers. It takes a ton of patience and strategy.
All right, Steven. It's been incredibly insightful having you on the show. Before we wrap up, if you have any final advice you would want to give to our listeners who are considering building a business around an open source product, what would that be? Otherwise, it's been great having you on the Data Product Files.
Final advice is keep your community at the center of your project. All the things you do, think about what the community, the users, their problems, right? And then know how you're going to add value beyond the open source code and stay adaptable as your company grows. So the open source world moves very, very fast. Jump on it. I think they can be incredible. They're incredible for the world. They're great things for the whole world. And if you can harness that and be involved with it, I think it's a great way to grow a career as well and grow a company. Thank you, Richa. Thank you, Suhas, for having me.
Thank you so much for being here, Stephen, and all the best. I know everyone. I think everyone listening in, don't forget to check out what Stephen's building. He's been building something new, and Richa and me are also going to be very, very tuned and excited for what you're building next, Stephen. Thanks once again for joining us today.